Perfect. All right, so let's go ahead and get going here. So I've shown this fact sheet, this slide before in some of my other talks. So this may be kind of some repeat information for some of you, but especially since we're talking about oak trees, I think it's important to talk about some tree facts of Kentucky, especially with this being the month of Arbor Day. I think that's only appropriate to do that. And so Kentucky actually has quite a bit of acreage when it comes to forest. Um, Really, about 12.4 million acres of forests are found in Kentucky, primarily hardwood forest. And a lot of the tree species that are found in these forests are going to be primarily an oak hickory assortment of trees. Now, we do have over 120 other native tree species. We do have a few conifers as well, but majority of our forests, you are going to see kind of this combination of oak and hickory species. And so, with our talk today, there are over 20 different oak species that are native here to Kentucky. Now, for the sake of time, I can't talk about all of them, so we're going to focus in on about 10 of those species today. So I apologize if I don't get to your favorite oak, but certainly we can still talk oak trees because they're just a marvelous group. Um, but yes, so just kind of wanted to share a little bit of that interesting fact. The other common tree species we also see in Kentucky is the red maple, and we talked about that a little bit in our maple class. So as always, I like to give you all a list of resources. So if you are out in the woods and you need help identifying a tree, what are some good books or field guides, or what are some good websites to go to with just general information? So this is kind of your list here. So of course, our Native Plant Society, our Arbor Day Foundation, our Department of Forestry at the university, and our state division of forestry. Those are all great resources. And then you've got your Tree Finder book, which is a wonderful little pocket guide that you can fit. It's like a little dichotomous key that helps you with figuring out some of your tree species here, as well as if you need a bigger book, The Trees and Shrubs of Kentucky is an older but a very good book that is still pretty prevalent today. The scientific names may have changed a little bit in it, but for the most part, the identification of different tree species is a great guide for you. So just kind of wanted to share some of those resources. So let's get down into the nitty gritty about oak trees. And I know oaks tend to be, kind of a favorite among tree lovers. With oaks, they belong, especially the ones we're talking about, to the Quercus genus. And the Quercus genus is part of the Fagaceae family, which is the beech family. And you'll actually see a little bit of similarities between oaks and beeches that we'll talk here briefly. But we think there's about 450 species that belong to this group. And the thing about oak trees, um, yes, they are pretty well prevalent to North America. A pretty high ratio of them are found in North America, but we do see species in Europe and Asia as well. And the interesting thing with oak trees, especially depending on the grouping, they can be found in very interesting sites. A lot of them have preferences. Maybe they prefer to be on a certain slope or down in the bottomland. Maybe they like more wet soils versus more dry. Some of them even prefer kind of more alkaline to acidic soils. So really, oak trees kind of vary quite a bit with what their preferences are. Now, with that said, certain oaks may be specific to sites in that they don't grow well elsewhere. But then other species are quite adaptable and actually do very well in more urban environments. And we'll talk about some of those oaks today that they make great landscape trees, great street trees, if you will. Now, one thing I'll mention when it comes to oaks, many of our oaks have what we call a taproot system. And with a taproot system, sometimes if you're trying to transplant an oak that is already established in a certain area, it can be slightly problematic just because if you kind of break off that taproot, it could permanently damage that tree and it may not transplant well. And so just something to think about is the growth nature of these trees. If some of these do have a taproot system, they may be a little bit more difficult to transplant, especially if they're an older tree versus a sapling, so to speak. But that is a trend that we see is kind of a lot of these plants have the tap roots. Something else that they all have generally when it comes to a leaf arrangement, whether it's alternate, opposite, or whorled, they generally have an alternate leaf arrangement. And then their leaves are very interesting. And we're going to kind of break this down depending on kind of the grouping, whether it's considered in the red oak group versus the white oak group. Their leaves may vary a little bit, but for the most part, they may have lobed leaves, kind of finely toothed leaves, or even ones that have more smooth edges, smooth margins, just depending. Now, one thing that's found on oak trees is the flowers, and we see this with other tree species as well. They are flowers called catkins, where you have male catkins and you have female catkins that are occurring on these trees. Generally, they're going to be blooming all during the springtime. When it comes to a catkin, basically that's this reproductive flower that typically has no petals. It's apetalous, right? And it's typically just a single sex, like I said. So there's either male catkins and then there's separate female catkins. And a lot of times they're drooping. They like to droop in clusters or pairs, and we'll see some examples of that too. But with catkins, generally how they are pollinated is by wind. They're wind pollinated, carried by the wind. And something that kind of adds to the confusion with oaks, because we have so many different oaks, is it is possible for oaks to cross-pollinate, and then you get an interesting, offspring of two species. And so, that's where it gets very difficult sometimes, like if you're out in the woods to maybe classify what a particular oak is. They're very difficult to distinguish. I'm not going to lie. They can be difficult to identify. And also if you add the component where they could cross-pollinate and be a combination of two trees, then it may get a little bit confusing. So you're not alone. Oaks have always been a little bit difficult to identify, but we'll try to break down some of the ones here today for you. In addition to these catkins, once they are pollinated, eventually it's going to bear fruit, which is an acorn, which is the very stereotypical kind of nut that we see on oak trees. Generally, this acorn nut does have a cap, and we'll kind of break down the differences between acorns, between species, as well as how long it takes those acorns to mature, because that can differ depending on the type of oak as well. So we'll talk more about acorns here in a minute. The other thing that I want to mention too, and this kind of goes along with beeches, that you all may notice that oaks and beeches themselves, especially young beeches, those groupings, they tend to hold on to their leaves even after the fall color has faded. So the leaves have turned completely brown on the trees, but they linger on those trees for a period of time, like even over winter, before they start to shed in the spring. And that's this concept that we call marcescens. And with marcescens, there's a few different reasons for that. It could be that it's providing protection for the developing buds, where the leaves are kind of insulating it, if you will, from extreme winter temperatures or snow or things like that. Or kind of what we think mostly could be due to prevention of wildlife from feeding on the trees. It kind of helps to prevent predation of those tree buds. And so if you've ever wondered why specifically these trees have held onto their leaves compared to other tree species, well, that's just, some example, some possibilities of what, as to what they could be doing. So let's talk about the importance of oaks because they are a very important tree, very important. So let's talk about the economic importance and then we'll get into ecological. Number one, lumber. Oaks are critically important in the timber industry. Oaks have been used quite often in construction and flooring, furniture, millwork, you name it. They still are very prevalent and a much needed resource. And depending on the oak, some may be of a little bit higher value than others. And so, especially when we get into the realm of forestry, we kind of take a look at that, the value of our oak timber. But if you kind of set that aside, what are some other economic importance to oak trees? And that's just for ornamental, aesthetically. So oak trees make great shade trees. And a lot of times, if we are trying to forest our parks for recreational purposes, trying to provide additional shade, or even for ourselves, if we have a much larger yard and we don't have risk of power lines being nearby, okay, don't plant these under power lines because oaks can get very tall. Like, if you're going to have a nice shade tree, an oak makes a nice shade tree, but you got to give it plenty of space. Otherwise, you may want to choose a different option. But a lot of people like to plant oaks for that reason. And most of the time, oaks are also very long-lived trees. They're going to last potentially hundreds of years in that setting, if not longer than that. So they're really a good investment, if you will. And so going aside from economic purposes, ecological importance. They are what we consider the keystone tree species for our wildlife, our insect populations. If you're going to plant anything in your yard, you plant an oak because that is going to help so many different animal species. So for instance, we think, just based on some studies, and I'm going to talk about this book that I had pictured here in a minute, but we think that oaks can really support over 200 species of insects, specifically Lepidopteran. So that's your moths and your butterfly species. And so without oaks, a lot of these caterpillars wouldn't be able to feed on these trees and then develop pupate into adults, and then those adults lay eggs and kind of go through that cycle. And so they need oaks as this host plant. So it's very important for, especially, a lot of these could be pollinators too, as well, but just with helping to improve insect diversity, which is critical for maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And so also not just with insects, but wildlife, birds. So these are huge trees. They have quite a bit of canopy cover. And so, they provide nesting ground, shelter for wildlife, for our birds, for our small mammals. I mean, this is where a lot of them tend to go to. And with that, they also are a source of nourishment for them as well. Not only are the acorns feeding the birds and mammals, but even Animals may browse on the leaves as well, or even the bark. So this is, again, very critical when it comes to our animals, our biodiversity. If we don't have oak trees, we'd be in a lot of trouble, to be honest with you. And that's where let me talk about this book briefly. So there's an entomologist out of the University of Delaware named Douglas Tallamy, and he wrote a book called The Nature of Oaks. And it's a really great book that if you haven't read it yet, you should definitely do that, because he goes kind of by month the importance of what is going on with the oak trees during the time of the year, what insects that they are supporting, kind of going over those life cycles. And he gets into that with how important these oak trees are to, especially these insects' life cycles. And so definitely read it. It's a lot of information, but I feel like I don't know, even though it's a lot of information being thrown at you, I feel like it's an easier read because it's so interesting. So, and we do have the book here at our office. Like if you wanted to come, we have like a little book library in the back, in our back lobby, that you could rent out that book for free. You just take it with you, read it, and then bring it back when you're done. So definitely would 100% recommend that. All right. So now that I've kind of gone on my spiel with that, let's talk about identifying different oaks, and these groupings. So very commonly, we group oaks into two different categories: the red versus the white oak group. And you'll kind of see this too as we talk about some of these oaks. But it's kind of characterized primarily based on their leaf structure and then their acorns. So specifically start talking about the red group first. The red oak group typically has leaves that have what we call bristles that are at the tips of their lobes. So it looks a lot more pointy, and you can kind of see that long bristle tip. So it's very pointy. And then in addition to that, when it comes to red oaks, they tend to take a little bit longer for their acorns to develop and mature. So they could take 2 years, two full growing seasons before their acorns are ready. Whereas white oaks, their acorns only need typically one growing season or 1 year to mature. And then their leaves tend to lack those bristles and tend to be more of a kind of rounder lobe. Um, some could be still a tiny bit pointy, but typically it's kind of a little bit more rounder in nature. And that kind of is a helpful guide to you whenever you see an oak, and you're like, what oak is this? It's like, well, look at the leaves first and see if it's kind of got more pointed leaves with those bristles versus leaves that are more rounded that are lacking the bristles, because that can help you distinguish if it's a red versus white oak species. So, kind of bear all this in mind as we talk about these next few oaks. Okay. First one, talking about a huge one. I have to start off with the biggest one first, right? The bur oak. And the bur oak is he's quite a giant, and I'd say he's a giant more because of the acorns that he produces. Um, but before I get into the acorns, let's talk about the tree itself. So primarily, bur oaks are found more in rich bottomlands. They can tolerate a wide variety of soil conditions, and they will actually tend to do very well as a park or yard tree if you've got a yard big enough for it. Now, as I'm going to talk about, is these oaks get big. So gets about 70 to 80 feet tall. It's very common for oaks to even exceed over 100 feet tall. So again, you need to have the space to house this oak tree. So if you have um, a yard that's pretty small, like under, say, like a half acre where you have power lines and it's too close to your house, probably not a good idea to be planting an oak. You may want to go with, a smaller, more compact tree. So now if you have quite a bit of acreage or you have a farm or you have fields where you can plant oaks where they're not going to be an issue to structures or power lines, then definitely by all means be planting these. We want more of these planted. But just kind of keep that in mind. Now, some oaks can be faster growing versus slower growing than others. Bur oak is a relatively fast growing oak species, and it also is more longer lived. It can live up to, a few hundred years old. Now, this oak in particular has a very interesting leaf on it. And let me see if I can, there we go. Let me move this a little bit so you can kind of see the picture. Um, so it has these rounded lobes. You can kind of tell that, but what we call the sinuses, which are almost like these deep indentations, if you will, in the leaf, those sinuses almost divide the leaf completely in half. Okay. And so what you'll see then is that the base of the is kind of more of this wedge shaped, whereas then you can kind of see the other aspects, those 5 to 7 lobes, if you will. Now, when it comes to oak leaves, they do tend to look different above on the upper leaf surface versus the undersides of the leaves. So we'll talk about that too. So like in particular for the bur oak, it tends to have kind of this deeper green, leathery type leaf on the upper side, whereas the underside tends to be more grayish of a color and actually kind of hairy. It's a bit fuzzy, has what we call this dense pubescence to it. And you'll kind of notice that with some of our oaks too, is they can have kind of a little bit of this pubescence on those leaves. Now, when it comes to bark, so I'll say this, for the most part, oak trees, their bark is going to look very different from when it's young and immature versus when it's older. A lot of times, whenever oak trees are younger, usually it's kind of this lighter, smooth bark. And then as it ages, the bark may darken and then become more furrowed, if you will, kind of have more of these interesting patterns to it. So just know that for the most part, the bark we're going to be talking about is primarily going to be more mature oaks that you notice. So in this case, you can see with this picture, this tends to have a more gray bark that's deeply furrowed and grooved. Now, the acorns themselves, which you can kind of see the pictures of, these are big acorns and they kind of have this really fun fringed cup to them. And a lot of times when we look at these, we may mistake them for like the spiny burr of a chestnut, when it's not actually a chestnut, it's just the acorn of the bur oak, which is kind of where it gets its common name from. But it definitely has that appearance to it. Um, so they can be quite big in comparison to some of the others and very hairy, if you will. Now, when it comes to fall leaf color, because we'll talk about this as well, this is the bur oak has more of a muted fall color, more of your brown, coppery colorations, whereas some of the other oaks we'll talk about do have a little bit more splendid fall color. Um, But again, this is a good tree to be planting, especially in recreational sites, if you have a big yard or area you can devote for it. And of course, it is an excellent food source for wildlife species, hosts a wide variety of moths and butterflies. All of them do, but I will say some species maybe more so than others. Okay. Next one is our chinkapin oak. Uh, this is Quercus muhlenbergii. And this is one of those oaks that actually prefers more alkaline soils. And when I say alkaline, if we remember on our pH scale, the pH scale is 1 to 14 and 7 is neutral. If it's above 7, it's alkaline. If it's below 7, it's acidic. Um, Even though a lot of plants tend to prefer slightly acidic conditions, in particular, this oak, however, likes more alkaline. So it likes a pH that's above 7. So you may see it kind of planted, naturally growing in more alkaline conditions. And it does prefer more well-draining soils as well. It can tolerate some wet and some dry conditions, but for the most part, it needs to be relatively well-draining to support this tree. Now, with this, this is a white oak grouping, and so you can kind of see here that its leaves are lobed, although they're not quite as rounded as typical white oaks. They kind of do have a little tooth to them, if you will, but they're very shiny on the surface and then very dull on the other sides with the little fine white hairs. Now, the acorn in this that you can see is just kind of a light brown acorn, and the cap itself is more pubescent. So if you touch it, it's kind of a little bit more hairy and gray in appearance compared to other acorns. Now, when it comes to the bark itself, it tends to be a lighter gray color, very rough, and then quite fissured as it ages. But it doesn't quite form a pattern to it like some of the other ones. Sometimes with certain tree species, as they age, those burrows and those fissures tend to have these beautiful, almost like weaved or braided patterns, and you don't really see that as much on this one. For this oak, the fall color is typically more of a yellow to brownish color. And again, good supporter of wildlife and insects. Primarily the wood that was used for this oak was for making barrels and for fencing materials. So one that we see pretty often is northern red oak. And northern red oak, Quercus rubra being red. So that's where we can really rely on our scientific nomenclature with understanding this tree. But it's helpful because it's a red oak, because it has a very lovely fall color. You can kind of see in the top picture here. It has more of this reddish to brownish fall color, which is very pleasing to the eye. But this is what we consider more of an upland oak species. We find this on certain slopes, but they do like it to be relatively moist in nature. So that's kind of a little bit of difference there. They don't like to be too dried out. This is a faster growing, like, not to like stereotype, red oaks maybe tend to be a little bit faster growing than white oaks, just depending on the species, especially with the white oak, that's a more slow growing one. But this one can get anywhere between 60 to 100 feet tall. You can see the lobes are very pointed. It gets 7 to 11 pointed lobes, and you can see kind of the little bristle tips. It's very smooth and dark green on the upper side, and I mean, very dark green on the upper side and then smooth on the underside, almost glossy in appearance. And then occasionally the leaf stem or leaf petiole itself, and you can maybe see that a little bit in the picture with the acorn, can be reddish in color. Now, what's interesting about the bark of this tree, and this is a really good one, especially if you're outside hiking in the woods and it's winter and you're really having to rely on the bark of the trees for identification. This is a relatively easy one to identify. And so the overall bark of the red oak is this brownish gray color, but it has these vertical stripes that are much paler in color, almost white. So you can see that lovely contrast between the rest of the bark and those lighter vertical stripes. So that can help be a good indicator for you that this is a red oak, even if the leaves are not there on the oak tree. You know, sometimes if the leaves hang around, you might be able to see the leaves, but if for some reason the leaves are off of the tree and you can't tell, or they're too high up, then, you know, you look at that bark as an indicator. The acorn itself is interesting where the cap on it is a little bit flatter. And so a lot of times our caps tend to be a little bit rounder, and it's a relatively big acorn, can get up to an inch. The interesting thing about this, and you'll notice this with several of our oak species, is a lot of our oaks are not going to start bearing fruit. They're not going to start bearing acorns till they're around close to 20 years of age. So in particular, the red oak is going to be closer to 25. So if you've just planted an oak tree, you're going to have to wait a long time. I hate to tell you, for for you to be able to see acorns eventually. So yeah, that's going to take a lot of patience. Now, when it comes to red oaks, some of the key dispersers for acorns, and this can be for a lot of other oak trees as well, but gray squirrels help with dispersing these acorns around to help with their reproductive life cycle, but as well as certain birds like blue jays are avid fans of these acorns. And so they will also help with dispersal of the seeds too. So, you know, wildlife is very critically important in getting these trees to spread in their ecosystem. It's essential for them to spread in their ecosystem. I'd mentioned this with the reddish coloration, good fall color, and northern red oak is very important in the lumber industry as well, but it does make a very good shade tree too. Nuttall oak. And you know, when I was coming up with some of the oaks to talk about, something that I thought about was, okay, what are some oaks that we typically see, in all honesty, for our Arbor Day celebrations, maybe things that are passed out through the Arbor Day Foundation, Conservation District, things like that. And you know, just from the years that I've been in extension and have been to those, you know, those Arbor Day giveaways, you know, what are some oaks that I have seen quite a bit of distributed? And one of those is Nuttall oak. I've seen Nuttall oak, and I'll talk about another one here in a minute, has been distributed through those different agencies. So Nuttall oak, it's native to some of our wet bottomlands and more floodplain forests, but it is actually pretty adaptable to urban settings, or else we wouldn't be passing these out at these events if they couldn't actually tolerate a wide range of conditions. Um, but a fairly big tree as well, can grow up to 80 feet tall. It has very deeply lobed leaves with some bristle tips. So this is again kind of looking at more of our red oak. You can really see that well in the picture. Um, in the top picture, the bottom picture kind of shows more of the red leaf, and it looks like some of those bristle tips kind of broke off a little bit. So that may not be the best one for ID, but the top one is. Um, the bark itself, again, it's more smooth when it's young, but it develops, it gets darker as it ages and develops more of these flat-like ridges. The acorn itself is shallow and thin and has almost a more scaly cap to it. But a lot of people like Nuttall oak, just from what you can see in the picture. It has very lovely fall coloration, more of this red orange color. And it makes a really great shade tree, really great street tree, if you will, highly adaptable. And that's what you want. You want these oak trees, you know, if you're going to be planting them long term in a landscape, you want them to do very well in that setting. And so again, this is another great one for wildlife and butterfly moth species. Um, let me let me talk about pin oaks, and then something I haven't mentioned is what are some diseases that we see in oaks, and I'll briefly mention them after pin oak. Um, I know pin oak. I feel like people are like so over pin oaks and just like they were planted for like the past like 20, 30 years in everyone's landscapes and now people hate them. At least that's the impression I get. I don't know if that's the case or how you all feel about them. But pin oaks are one of our more common landscape oak trees. They are found in more swamp to marsh-like environments, but again, they can be adapted to a more urban landscape, although they're going to be happier with a little bit more moisture. These are kind of one of our smaller oaks, only getting about 50 to 70 feet tall. But the reason people like them is because they're relatively fast growing. They're going to get bigger in a shorter amount of time. When they're young, they start out pyramidal in shape and then they have more of a rounded canopy with age. And the reason why people like them, you can kind of see from the picture, they have kind of almost this more graceful appearance. It's not very sloppy compared to others. And the reason for this lovely appearance is with the branching structure. So with the branches, you have kind of the lowermost branches, they angle downward, with the middle branches being horizontal, and then the upper branches kind of ascending upward. Okay, so that helps to give it that nice appearance. Now, with that said, people hate those bottom branches. They hate them because they get in the way whenever people mow. And so you tend to see a lot of people cut off those bottom branches in the landscape, or if those branches fall, people say it's a messy tree. So even though it's planted very commonly in the trade, a lot of people kind of complain about that. But that's just part of this oak's life cycle. Okay. That's how this oak grows. That's its nature. So, you know, if we're not happy with those bottom branches, then maybe we need to pick a different tree um, to mow around, or we need to add a nice kind of circle of mulch around the tree so that it doesn't impede with the mower. But the last thing we need is the mower to accidentally hit the tree and then we get injury caused to the tree. So um, if it's tree versus mower, I will always pick tree. Um, so it's like just plant accordingly whenever you're planting these, okay? Um, so other aspects of the pin oak. So these have typically dark green leaves with very five to seven sharply pointed lobes. So this is our red oak family. The sinuses, again, those indentations that we see generally for pin oaks have more of a U shape. in contrast to the scarlet oak that we're going to talk about next that has more of a C shape. So you can kind of, break down the differences there because a lot of people may get those confused a little bit. The bark for this is actually going to be relatively smooth in nature, and you're not going to see a lot of furrows in it quite compared to the other ones. This will bear acorns a little bit earlier within the 15 to 20-year range. And generally, the acorns have kind of a thinner, more smooth cap. The fall color is very lovely on pin oaks. They have more of this orange, bronze, red coloration to them. And again, we've talked about how it's a very popular shade tree. And then also a good host plant for some different butterfly species. Let me talk, before I move on to these other ones, let me talk real quick about diseases, okay? So oak trees, again, are very adaptable, very resilient trees, but they can succumb to certain diseases. One of them being oak wilt, which we don't like to see. And then another one that unfortunately have seen quite a bit of. So I go out to site visits every year. And it seems like anytime somebody calls me with an oak tree problem, it's always this disease, and that's bacterial leaf scorch. Now, bacterial leaf scorch is not found just on oak trees. It can be found on other tree species, but I'm telling you, here in this county, in Hopkins County, I've seen it most on oak trees, where you get this scorching along the margins, along the edges of those leaves. And eventually it kind of that browning, that necrosis expands to the entire leaf, and then you get leaf drop. A lot of times this is spread through an insect vector where the insect vector is feeding on the tree and then injecting that bacteria, and that bacteria then infects the tree. And then with this, it can take a period of time for it to really set in. And even if the tree does go into decline from bacterial leaf scorch, it may take a little bit of time before it, say, succumbs to it. Usually there's other factors involved as well. But if you're kind of seeing issues with your oak that are kind of some of the symptoms that I'm describing that you've seen in years past, definitely reach out to me about that, because again, it is something that we've kind of seen most in this county that I've noticed. And all I can say is this, kind of knocking on wood, is hopefully we don't come across any more diseases or invasive insects that could really harm our oak populations, because we've already had these issues. Say, for example, for insects, emerald ash borer destroying our ash trees, to chestnut blight, to Dutch elm disease, just so much plaguing our native trees that so many of them have been lost. And the one tree we especially don't need to be lost or destroyed is the oaks, for how important they are, not just economically, but again, ecologically to our biodiversity. So let's hope that nothing comes, that we don't see any invasive insect or invasive disease that kind of comes to the Americas and really starts to harm our oak trees, or else that would be very, very bad. But let me go back to the oaks, because I don't want to end on a depressed note. Let's keep talking about these. So scarlet oaks. Scarlet oaks, called the scarlet oak because it has beautiful fall color, a bright, deep red color to it. It's found in more dry upland forests, gets about 50 to 80 feet tall, and can be very long-lived. This also goes by the name black oak too. So also goes by that common name. It has glossy leaves with the pointed lobes that are bristle tips. So again, red oak family. And then the sinuses have more of a C shape versus the U shaped on the pin oak. The bark has kind of more finer fissures and more scaly ridges. So it does kind of create a little bit of that kind of pattern. Kind of reminds me of like a flowing river or stream, if you will. And then this is going to bear acorns at about 20 years of age. And the acorns have kind of more of a deeper bulb shape to them compared to others. So this is also one that you can plant very well in the landscape, and will also host a wide variety of insect pollinators. Shumard oak. This was the other oak that I thought about when I was thinking Arbor Day trees. Arbor Day trees. What are some of the oaks I've seen for Arbor Day? And a Shumard oak is one of them that I've seen over the years. Probably because it's very fast growing, very adaptable. So it's a good shade tree for different recreational areas and yards as well. A little bit smaller, if you will, for compared to other oaks, about 70 feet tall. But this is great because this oak can tolerate drought, it can tolerate flooding, so it's really good to a range of different environmental conditions. So if you have a spot that's not great, you might want to pick the Shumard oak because it can adapt pretty well. So the shape of this is kind of similar to others. It's going to be pyramidal when it's young and then rounded as it ages. It has more the 2 to 4 pairs of pointed lobes with the bristle tips. And I realized as I made this presentation, I became very biased to red oaks. And I apologize that we're talking about a lot of red oaks, but it just kind of happened. This has this kind of sharp, shiny dark green leaf and a paler green underside with tufts of hair, as similar to others. Now, the bark, when it's older, is more furrowed, so you can kind of see that distinguishing factor there on the trunk. Now, the acorns themselves, they're not a good bowl shape. And in fact, they're more oblong to ovoid, almost egg-shaped in nature. And they are produced after about 25 years. This does get more red color to it, so it does have some nice fall leaf color. And again, is a good supporter of butterfly species. And one thing I'll mention is some of the lepidopterans we see is, especially with oaks, could be things like the imperial moth. It could be the dusty wing butterflies, things of that nature are what we see that like to use the oak as its host plant. All right, southern red oak. So I know talking about northern red oak, southern red oak, yeah, it gets confusing, especially with the common names. When you see northern, southern, swamp this, swamp that, yes, it can easily get confusing, but they are very different from each other. So the southern red oak is found in poor upland soils, sometimes, but it can sometimes be found along streams. So again, is adaptable in that way. It can get up to 100 feet tall, so it's one of our taller oaks. Has more of a broad, open, rounded form. The leaves themselves are very interesting. So on the upper side, they're very dark green, but then they are more tan on the underside. And there's actually 2 different types of leaves. So the first type, the lobes, again, these have bristles, so red oak are bristle tipped with the terminal lobe being longer and kind of more of a U-shaped base, whereas the other one has almost this pear-shaped with 3 rounded lobes. So you can kind of see that here in the picture. So you can get a little bit of variation on the leaves. it reminds me a little bit of like, say, the sassafras tree, which is not an oak, but sassafras has the three different leaf shapes on it too. So you can see a little bit of variation there with this oak as well. Now, the bark is scaly with deep, narrow furrows. The acorn itself has a bowl-shaped cap and can be kind of warty with little hairs on it. The fall color is really nothing quite aesthetic compared to other red oaks. This is going to be more of a reddish brown color. But on the flip side to that, this is one of the more beneficial oaks for wildlife. It's definitely kind of preferred with some of our bird and mammal species compared to others. And again, this can grow as a good street tree, more urban tree. All right. Swamp white oak. So we're going to talk about swamp white oak first, then we're going to finish up with white oak. So swamp white oak, not to confuse you, probably should start with white oak first, but we're kind of going in alphabetical order here. Swamp white oak is Quercus bicolor. And why it gets the name bicolor is because of the leaves. The leaves are two-toned in color, where the upper half is glossy and dark green and the undersides have kind of a silvery white appearance. Tomentose meaning kind of more of a fuzzy appearance, which really that's nothing new to oak trees, but it's getting its name because of that. So you can kind of see that. This is a white oak, so it has kind of those rounded, more shallow lobes to them. This is a smaller growing oak, only 50 to 60 feet tall, with where its name comes from. It does prefer swampy areas, lowlands, floodplains, you name it, that way. Now, its size and appearance is a little bit different, where it has a shorter trunk with a more oval crown, and the bark is very interesting. It does get furrows and ridges, but it's very common for the branches of this tree to have more of a peeling bark. And so that can help you with distinguishing what oak is this. If you get confused by the leaves and you're like, I see this as a white oak, but what kind of white oak is it? If you see peeling bark along the branches, it's probably a swamp white oak. And when I think peeling bark, my first thing that comes to mind is like the exfoliating bark on sycamores or things like that is what it reminds me of. Something else, the acorns themselves actually have longer stalks attached to them. And what's interesting with the life cycle of this swamp white oak is you're only going to get a good crop of acorns every 3 to 5 years. So it may be very sparing with the acorns certain years than others. And that's something that we sometimes see with nut trees, just in general, like things like, even your pecans as well, where you may have a good crop one year and hardly any the next year. And really, kind of the research studies are out on that as to what the reason is. It could be that the tree's just saving its energy up. It could just be based on drought versus, wet weather conditions. It could be a couple factors that's causing that. But this is something that we notice with the swamp white oak. This is a very long-lived, durable plant. A lot of our white oaks are. And kind of the uses for this one specifically is the inner bark was used heavily in the leather tanning industry. And so if you think about it, the acorns too, I mean, the bark itself as well, but this tree has what we call tannins in it, tannins that are used, of course, with leather making industry, but also tannins in general, this chemical it's used to kind of create the, well, not, it causes, let me say causes, the tannins like in the bark or in the acorn causes a bitter taste. Okay, a bitter taste where some of the wildlife may not prefer it, so it may be used as a predation tool. Um, so it's not being eaten quite as much. Um, but I will say, if you successfully kind of cook out, boil, like say the acorns, and you remove the tannins from them, then it is edible. It could be edible to people, but again, you have to remove the tannins first. And also, again, bitter taste. But some people have used like acorns to make kind of this acorn flour before. So, not saying you should do that, but has been used for that sort of thing. So, that's something that I forgot to mention earlier when talking about oaks is the tannins that are typically found in oak trees. Now, with that being said, something else I'll mention is oaks quite frequently were used by our indigenous population, our Native American population, for a treatment of different ailments, from using the acorns, from using the bark. To either kind of brew some kind of tea or to kind of break down into as some kind of food product, but using it for medicinal purposes. And so there is a little bit to that when it comes to culturally. Different oaks were used for those purposes, not just as building materials, so to speak. And so that's the one thing with swamp white oak, and I see kind of a bit with white oaks in general is, these have a history of being used for different things. And it could be anything from trying to treat a common cold to, muscle pains or things like that. All right, let me finish up with the white oak since I'm almost out of time here, but let me finish with the best oak. No, they're all great oaks, but I mean, we do have to give credit to our white oak, okay? Because this is our giant, right? These get quite tall. These can get over 135 feet tall, and they are very long lived. I mean, white oaks can easily live several hundred plus years. So they've been around for a long time. Typically, where we see these are more in dry woodlands, rocky hillsides, or bottomlands that are more well draining. These are slow growing. So if you're planting a white oak, again, you have to just be quite patient with it. It has those finger-like lobed rounded leaves, typical of a white oak. When it's young, it's more pyramidal and then has a rounded crown at maturity. The bark itself is gray and scaly, and it gets kind of these little vertical blocks to it. The catkins on this one, I'll mention this, are usually longer. The male ones are usually longer and more yellowish green, so they're a little bit more aesthetic, whereas a lot of people may not even notice, like if their oak trees are even blooming, or they'll just notice the remnants that are on the ground. Usually they're like, what is all this stuff on my driveway? But, the catkins do look a little bit different when it comes to white oaks. Um, this acorn is longer and kind of has more of a lumpy cap to it. The fall color is not as extraordinary as others. It's kind of more of a dark red to brown fall color. But this is used very commonly as a shade tree. Again, you got to have plenty of space for it. And then this is the oak you're planting for birds, for mammals, for insects. So again, for your butterfly species, think of the imperial moth, think of the dusty wings, and the other one that I couldn't remember earlier was the hair streaks. A lot of hair streak butterflies also rely on oak trees. So definitely use the white oak. Plant a white oak if you can, because it is just the best one for biodiversity. Um, when it comes to other things, it's also one of the most important oaks for the timber industry as well. So, you know, it's kind of our poster child. It's our showcase for when it comes to oaks of all oaks. You think of just the gigantic white oak. Um, so definitely to end on that, one of our most important oak species that we see here that we want to be planting. So with that, I'm actually stunned that I stayed on time because I thought this would go way longer. So I'm proud of myself. Let me go ahead. Let me stop sharing this for a second because there's something else I want to show you all. Um, but yeah, just kind of going back to it again, oak trees are just so crucial to our ecosystems. And so if we can plant oaks, or if we know that there are trees that are dying and we need to replace the tree, consider replacing it with an oak if it's in the right environment. Because that's really what we need right now, especially as some of our other tree species are failing. Let me go ahead and stop recording.